Thanks, Derval. Minister, fellow distinguished speaker, guests. I'd like to thank the organisers very much for asking me to come and speak on what proves time and again to be such an essential topic. It has indeed, as Conor and Derval have outlined, been a difficult time for the justice system, with seemingly no quarter emerging unscathed. And I think the one event last year that I'd point to that hasn't been mentioned would be the publication of the Garda Inspectorate's report on the investigation into serious crime, which personally I found to be one of the most damning reports that we've seen on policing in Ireland, given that it wasn't a response to an individual case or scandal, but more of a general overview of how serious crime was being investigated. As Derval mentioned, I was lucky enough to get to move back to Ireland 3 weeks ago, having spent most of the last decade living in the UK. And I moved back excited personally and professionally to see, to try and make some kind of contribution to Irish society and to the progress of our justice system. In the short time since I've moved back, I've had numerous opportunities to engage with individuals and organisations working hard similarly to make a contribution to our justice system. It's really inspiring and encouraging to encounter such people, but all too often their motivations are heartbreaking stories of people who've been let down by our state. Too regularly in my work, I am contacted by people claiming to have suffered greatly at the hands of our justice system. I've met recently with the families of both Shane Tuohy and Shane Farrell, some of whom are here today. Both of these families lost a loved one, with no allegation that this was at the hands of the state, I should add. Both families are distraught at the state investigations into these deaths, which have resulted in no direct convictions for those deaths. They feel that rather than helping, the justice system has caused them even more suffering. I can't comment on the veracity of any claims they make, but I can say that families who've suffered as these families have should not have to fight as they are fighting to seek justice, to understand what happened, or to be heard. They've encountered bureaucracy and regulations which have not operated to assist them, and they've encountered attitudes of defensiveness and secrecy which have left them feeling isolated and traumatised. I was struck recently at an event by a comment by Brian Sheehan of Glen that their strategic approach to LGBT equality in Ireland was change the laws, change the culture, change the lived experiences. This, I think, applies equally to policing. Our ultimate goal should be to change the lived experience of policing, change how the public experience their interactions with the Gardaí, change how those who work with the Gardaí on a day-to-day basis experience those encounters, but also change the lived experience of being a guard in Ireland, which I think has been very difficult over the last 10-15 years. Those lived experiences can never be consistently perfect, and reforms must be an ongoing process of reflection and change. But aiming to improve those lived experiences is a tangible way of conceptualising reform. The first step mentioned is to change the laws. Legislative change should ensure that we have a police system which is appropriately empowered to perform its functions, required to do so in a way which respects the human rights of all, a system that is well governed and accountable, and which is required to be open and engaging in its work with others. Significant and positive changes are coming with the Victims of Crime Bill, the changes to GSOC's powers and the Policing Authority. We need to get those changes right on paper first, though that won't always be enough. I've argued, for instance, elsewhere, that GSOC has great potential on paper, but because of cultural problems, it's not living up to that potential. Changing culture in any organisation is difficult. Changing it in a police service is a monumental undertaking, and I don't envy those tasked with it. My research leads me to believe that committed leadership, stronger accountability and depoliticisation, as well as eradicating the legacy of weaknesses in those areas, are central to achieving those cultural changes in An Garda Síochána and the justice system more broadly. The plans for reform are multifaceted, but given both its significance and the restrictions on time today, I'm going to focus on just one element of that, the creation of the Policing Authority and its potential contribution to the depoliticisation of policing. Announced in the middle of last year, with a promise that it will be in place by the end of 2014, the legislation is now passed through the Seanad. With the Dáil in recess, obviously it'll be the autumn at the earliest when it is enacted. While this seems like delay, it may in fact prove much needed time for reflection. As I'm going to argue, the current proposals do not provide the necessary changes to the rules in order to effect the changes to culture and to lived experiences. So what's the body supposed to do? At a conference last year, the Minister stated, and I hope she won't mind me quoting her, that it will bring a new layer of public accountability and transparency to the administration and oversight of policing in the state. It will be set up as a pillar of integrity, which will, I believe, greatly reinforce public confidence in the working of our police services. This is an encouraging aspiration, but I'm going to argue that we need this body to be more than a new layer of accountability and transparency. We need it to assume real power over policing. Why do we need that? People respond differently when you have discussions with them about crime and public order, and that often depends on their politics. The fear that things like crime and public order creates in people rightly brings them to the forefront of many national debates. Policing is political, with a big P and a little p. The concern I have is when those politics influence how the police conduct themselves. It can happen in numerous different ways on something of a scale, and I'd like to point out 4 different ways that I think policing influences politics, and this should be borne in mind when we're contemplating reform. At the most simple form, or the most individual form, we must acknowledge that police officers bring their politics to bear on policing. They have a lot of discretion in their job. When they make decisions, they will often be informed by their own politics. It's hard to eradicate that. And as studies worldwide have shown, people who are attracted to policing tend to be very conservative politically. So that's one way that politics can influence policing. Another way is to think about the laws that the police are enforcing. The legislature passes laws criminalising behaviours and requiring the police to enforce those laws. On occasion, those laws that are created are based more on political or moral beliefs rather than, for instance, harm-based or human rights justifications. Examples of this, for instance, will be the criminalisation of abortion or the criminalisation of cannabis. I'm not making an argument about those, just saying that those are more politically or morally motivated criminalisations. The next form of political influence I've mentioned is passive political control. Government in this scenario is not actively directing policing, but there's no doubt that government wields potential power over the police due to their capacity to determine budget, appointments, policy, and so on. This may create a perception, if not a reality, that police will bend the perceived will of government. Finally, we can imagine a scenario where the government or the minister actively directs police to take certain actions. This could be ongoing, like in police states or dictatorships, or one-off events. And it would be disingenuous not to acknowledge that there have been times when such questions have arisen in Ireland. These are all different ways in which politics can influence policing, not all of which are immediately apparent. The third, that idea of passive political control, is one that I think we in Ireland should be very concerned about. It's difficult to spot, less easy to establish, but through separation of powers over policing, quite avoidable. The need for the police to remain apolitical was highlighted by Minister for Justice Kevin O'Higgins addressing early members in 1926. And I quote, "The internal politics and political controversies of the country are not your concern. You will serve with the same imperturbable discipline and with increasing efficiency any government which has the support of the majority of the people's elected representatives. Party will no doubt succeed party in the ebb and flow of political tide, new issues will arise and the landmarks of today will disappear, but you will remain steadfast and devoted in the service of the people and of any government which may please the people to return to power." This message, as I said, delivered in 1926, was no doubt born of a fear that in the turbulent times following independence and civil war, the police force would be politically overrun and the fledgling government would lose capacity to maintain law and order. Indeed, just 5 years later, that fear would seem somewhat justified when Owen O'Duffy was dismissed from the post of Commissioner and went on to lead the Blue Shirts. This fear shaped policing in Ireland in practical and lasting ways, in the vesting of immense power over the police in government. This is unusual in Western democracies, though quite common for states emerging from transition, where concerns as to the loyalty of the police and the stability of order are commonplace. What is perhaps strange is that not only has the Irish government's control of policing not lessened as challenges to the stability of the state have waned, but that control has in fact been enhanced. The 2005 Act legislatively enshrined the Commissioner's accountability to the Minister, and it gave the government the power to demand any document relating to any investigation from the Gardaí. The governance system of the police in Ireland makes it possible for any of the above forms of political interference to occur. The government has the legislative power to exercise passive and direct control over policing. Added to this, we know little of how and when these powers are exercised because it happens behind closed doors, evidenced by the fact that a commission is required to establish the circumstances of Commissioner Callanan's resignation. A policing authority which assumes governance responsibility for policing could disrupt that pattern of influence. It could assist in depoliticised policing and in making its governance more open and transparent. It would provide a form of separation of powers. The original heads of the Policing Authority Bill were encouraging in this regard. That version transferred many key government powers to the authority, including holding the Commissioner to account, ensuring Garda resources were used to maintain the highest levels of efficiency and effectiveness, as well as monitoring Garda compliance with human rights. Unfortunately, by the time the bill was presented to the Seanad, these powerful sections had been deleted. Rather than achieving depoliticisation and a necessary separation of powers over policing, we instead will get an added layer of bureaucracy, something which serves only to make the governance of policing unwieldy and complicated. So how does the proposed legislation maintain political control over policing? I hope you indulge me because I have a bit of a list here. The following is a list of all the powers retained by either the Minister or the Government over policing. Now, many of these can be individually justified, but what I want to consider is the totality of these to demonstrate the scale of control which remains centrally vested. The Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner will be ultimately appointed and removed by Government. The Commissioner is accountable to Government, and I've seen it stated that the Commissioner will remain accountable to Government on matters of national security, but from my reading that's not accurate. The original provision on accountability is not altered. The Commissioner will remain accountable to the Minister for the performance of the Commissioner's functions and those of the Garda Síochána. So that pertains to all aspects of policing, not just national security. Policing plans, policing strategies and policing priorities must be confirmed by Government. Security priorities will be set by Government. The budget is determined by Government. The Minister can demand any documents of Garda Síochána. The Minister can issue written directives to Garda Síochána and to the authority. CCTV schemes must be approved by the Minister. Ministerial consent is required for GSOC to investigate the Commissioner. The Minister decides on the number of senior rank positions, consents to the number of civilian staff, the appointment of members of the Audit Committee, the appointment of the CEO of the authority. The Minister decides what constitutes state security, and I pause here to point out that we are now going to have a legislative definition of state security, which to my mind surely interpretation of that definition is then a legislative function rather than an executive one, which should be vested in the judiciary. Government consent is required for Gardaí to work with the police service in another state. The Minister authorises delegation of the Commissioner's functions to the Deputy Commissioner. The Minister can appoint someone to inquire into any aspect of policing, and statistical information on crime compiled by Garda Síochána is to go to the Minister and not the authority. Again, as I say, you can justify many of those individually, but I want to focus on the combination of those factors, which I see as problematic. The sum total is a situation where the Government continues to have what is, to my mind, too much control over policing. What powers then is the Government relinquishing? Government will no longer be involved in the appointment at lower ranks, have a stronghold over the appointment at the higher ranks, be involved in dismissal of Gardaí, be involved in the Garda Reserve, be required to publish a code of ethics, which it was required to do under the 2005 Act but didn't do, receive the 3-year review report or reports from the Garda Professional Services Unit, or have a role in joint policing committees. So that's a much shorter list. There are, of course, additional functions which the authority will have, like holding public meetings with the Commissioner, but these are added elements to the governance of Garda Síochána. The Minister and Government, I contend, will continue to have effective control over policing in Ireland. Why maintain this position? The reason cited by Government for the turnaround on the powers to be transferred to the authority is Article 28(2) of the Irish Constitution, which states, "The executive power of the state shall, subject to the provisions of the Constitution, be exercised by or on the authority of the Government." Don't have time to explore the complexity of this provision, but I'll make some brief points in the hope that we start what I think is a very necessary conversation. Only a small number of matters are explicitly stated in the Constitution to be executive functions, but the courts have agreed there are other implicit executive powers. There's little case law to aid us in interpreting this, very little of which specifically refers to policing. So whether or not, or the extent to which, policing falls within Article 28 is very unclear. Examination of the legal status of both individual Gardaí and the Commissioner presents problems for fitting their functions within Article 28. The fact that individual Gardaí have wide and discretionary powers to interfere with the constitutional rights of individuals, and that they can't be directed on when and how to use those, or when and if to use those, seems to me to be incompatible with the claim that theirs is an executive function. The function of the Commissioner is defined in the 2005 Act as being to direct and control on Garda Síochána and to advise the Minister on policing and security matters. Ministers have repeatedly declined to accept responsibility for the decisions of the Commissioner, as policies and practices are for the Commissioner to decide. The Minister's role is to hold the Commissioner to account for doing these jobs, not to have a hand in how they do them. Again, that indicates that the Commissioner is a powerful role in itself, which is also not compatible with the characterisation as an implicit executive function under Article 28. Given the legal status of both the Commissioner and individual Gardaí, it's difficult to conclude that policing generally is an executive function. What we perhaps can agree on is that the security of the state is an executive function. In debates in the Shannon, this has been the argument made by Minister Fitzgerald and Minister O'Riordan, that because An Garda Síochána is the state security service, then its work falls within Article 28. But even if we accept that national security is an executive matter, it doesn't follow that every single one of the controls which the government seeks to retain is an executive function. Immigration is an executive function, but that doesn't mean that all the relevant controls and powers are exercised by government. We need, to my mind, to tease out much more clearly the implication for police governance and accountability of classifying state security as an executive function. I don't believe that, for instance, that it automatically holds that because national security is an executive function, policing and not security strategies can only be approved by government. This is a complex extension of a constitutional provision, and it's certainly one that should be explored very carefully before being used to prevent the depoliticisation of policing. Even if we do accept the executive status of state security, what is being proposed is not necessarily the only option. A number of possibilities exist, so I'm going to present 5 possible options. Firstly, the government could publish the Attorney-General's advice and engage in a full debate about this constitutional argument. Secondly, perhaps quite unlikely, the government could be less cautious, enact what it originally proposed and let the courts determine the constitutionality of those provisions. Thirdly, we could see further separation within the current legislation. We see this, that the authority will be setting the policing priorities under the consent of the Minister, but the Minister will set the security priorities. We could see further separation, so the plans for both could be separated with more independent involvement in the policing arena. Fourthly, what if there were elected politicians on the authority? Would it be easier to delegate the executive functions if TDs were exercising those powers in conjunction with independent members? The all-independent panel model, which has been adopted, replicates the Scottish model, but Police Scotland is not normally heralded as a prime example of good police governance and accountability. Anyone who's familiar with their complaint system will know that. And yes, I appreciate that this would re-inject politicians into a system that I'm arguing we should depoliticise, but it would be more open and transparent, and it would enable delegating those powers away from government. Finally, if none of these options seem viable, we must question whether it is time to separate national security from An Garda Síochána. This is a development that I have resisted, believing that it will create an even more secretive, less accountable force to enforce the most intrusive state powers. That said, if none of the other options are possible, then it may be the time to accept this as the lesser of two evils and work with what Conor has suggested around developments of accountability in that area. In conclusion, if the policing authority legislation is enacted as it stands, it will not, I suggest, be able to contribute to any substantive reform of policing in Ireland. It will instead represent another layer of bureaucracy, another body to discuss policing, while the Minister and the Commissioner retain all core power over policing. It will not break the cycle we have found ourselves in of scandal, reform, scandal, or as Eddie Malloy put it last night, scandal, half-hearted reform scandal. We should, I feel, be very concerned at untested constitutional arguments being used as the reason for limited reform. These are not, to my mind, the kind of changes to law that will lead to changes in culture and changes in lived experiences. These are not the kind of changes which will give those who feel let down or victimised by the criminal justice system confidence that others will not have such experiences. This should worry us. It certainly worries me. Gurv Magad.